The conference room on the 40th floor of Vane Tower. 12 men sat around a long glass table, the most powerful faces on the East Coast, and across from them sat a young woman in a worn jacket, hair tied back in a messy knot, sitting straight as though the room belonged to her. On her wrist, among the luxury watches of the men around her, was a bracelet made of cheap plastic beads, the kind a child strings together. One man slammed the table. "Who the hell are you to be sitting here?" She didn't flinch. "The person who's going to keep this organization from collapsing in the next 30 days. If you can stay quiet long enough to listen." At the head of the table, Crosby Vane, the man who owned everything in this room, said nothing. He just sat there, watching her with the kind of look anyone who'd ever done business with him knew well. The look of a man deciding whether someone was worth keeping around or worth making disappear. But there was one detail no one in that room could make sense of. On Crosby Vane's wrist, just below a watch worth more than a house, was a beaded bracelet, similar in style to the one on her wrist. To understand why a girl with no degree, no name, no one raising a little sister on an unstable paycheck was sitting across from the most dangerous men in Ashford, and why the most powerful boss on the East Coast was wearing a child's toy on his wrist, we have to go back 3 months. To the night Crosby Vane discovered a traitor inside his own empire. If this story touched you, hit like and share it so others can hear it too. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next story, because sometimes the right story at the right time can change the way you see life. 3 months before that conference room scene, the 40th floor of Vane Tower was swallowed in darkness. Across the entire floor, the only source of light came from the computer screen inside Crosby Vane's office. The clock had already passed midnight, but he was still sitting there, scrolling through line after line of financial data. This was a habit no one in the organization knew about, not even Dorsey. At least twice a week, Crosby personally inspected the entire system himself. Not because he suspected anyone in particular, but because Crosby Vane had never trusted anyone enough not to check. The numbers jumped across the screen. Revenue, expenses, cash flow moving in and out among subsidiaries, investments, consulting fees. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Crosby stopped at a chain of wire transfers among 3 subsidiaries over the most recent 6 weeks. Each amount wasn't too large, and every transfer had a valid reason on paper. But when he pulled them all into the same table and placed them beside one another in chronological order, a trail appeared. The money had circled through 4 intermediary layers, then vanished into an account Crosby had never seen anywhere in the system. He sat up straight. His hands moved faster across the keys. He opened 3 more data tables and cross-checked them. The deeper he dug, the clearer the picture became. $80 million. It hadn't been lost because of a mistake or a failed investment. $80 million had been extracted systematically, in small portions, over 6 months, through transactions that looked completely legal. And what made Crosby's hands go still wasn't the number. It was the way it had been done. The vulnerability sat inside the internal financial protocol. This wasn't someone attacking from the outside. Someone on the inside, someone with high-level access, had planted an escape route right in the heart of the system. This person understood how Vane Capital operated. Understood it so well that they knew exactly where Crosby wouldn't look. Crosby picked up the phone. 1 call. "Get up here." 7 minutes later, Dorsey Mack walked into the office. He didn't ask why he'd been summoned after midnight. After 12 years at Crosby Vane's side, Dorsey knew that when his boss called at this hour, questions were pointless. Crosby turned the screen toward Dorsey. He didn't give a long explanation. He only pointed to the chain of transactions, to the money trail, to the final account. Dorsey read in silence, his eyes slowly narrowing. $80 million, Dorsey said, his voice low. 6 months, right in front of us. Who? Crosby shook his head. That was the problem. He could see the money flow, see the vulnerability, see the path. But the vulnerability was buried deep in the technical layer of the system, hidden behind transaction codes and automated protocols that even Crosby, a man who understood finance better than most Wall Street experts, didn't have enough technical knowledge to trace all the way back. He could see the symptoms, but he couldn't yet dissect the disease. That was the first time in 15 years of building his empire that Crosby Vane had faced a problem he couldn't solve by himself. And for a man who was used to controlling everything with his own 2 hands, that feeling was worse than losing $80 million. "Find me someone who can solve this," Crosby said, his eyes still fixed on the screen. "I don't care who they are. I don't care where they come from. One criterion only. Better than the person who planted this. Dorsey nodded and asked nothing more. He knew that when Crosby Vane used that voice, every question was unnecessary. Only results were allowed to exist. Dorsey walked out, the door closed behind him. Crosby turned back toward the glass wall and looked down over Ashford Bay. The city was still glowing beneath him. Millions of people asleep without knowing that on the 40th floor of this tower, the man who held half the East Coast had just discovered that his most dangerous enemy hadn't come from the outside. The enemy was sitting right there in his conference room, wearing a suit, shaking his hand every morning, and smiling as though nothing had happened. A few days earlier, on the other side of Ashford City, where the lights of Vane Tower couldn't reach, Lennox Shaw sat on the floor of a shabby rented apartment in the suburbs, with an old laptop open on her lap. The screen was covered in stickers from companies she had once worked for and then been fired from. Each sticker was a reminder that she was good enough to frighten people, and she had never learned how to make people less afraid. On the screen was this month's expense spreadsheet. The rent was 2 months late. The landlord had texted for the 3rd time that week, and this time, he wasn't polite anymore. The family health insurance would expire next Friday, and Lainey still didn't know where she was supposed to find the money to renew it. She closed the laptop, opened it, closed it again. The numbers didn't change just because she looked at them one more time. From the next room came the steady sound of Brinley's breathing. Lenny leaned over and looked through the half-open doorway. Her little sister was curled beneath a thin blanket, her face turned toward the door, and on her tiny wrist was the pink beaded bracelet she had strung herself that afternoon. Brinley was sleeping peacefully, the kind of sleep that belonged to a 7-year-old child who believed the world was safe because her sister was in the next room. Lenny turned back to the screen. The world wasn't safe. But Brinley didn't need to know that. Her phone vibrated. Unknown number. Lenny was about to ignore it, but at this hour of the night, unknown numbers usually weren't advertisements. She answered, but she didn't speak first. Lennox Shaw? A man's voice, low, direct, straight to the point. My name is Dorsey Mack. My boss needs someone capable of analyzing a financial system. The salary will be higher than any contract you've ever taken, including full family health insurance. Lenny went quiet for one beat. Not because of the offer, because of the obvious next question. Who's your boss? Crosby Vane. The room seemed to fall another degree deeper into silence. Everyone in Ashford knew that name, not because the press wrote about him often, because when people mentioned him, they usually did it very softly, the way people talked about a storm while it was still offshore. No, Lenny said flatly. I don't work for people like that. You haven't heard the whole thing. I don't need to hear the whole thing. Thank you. Good night. She was about to hang up. Dorsey didn't plead, didn't persuade. He only added one more sentence, in the voice of a man who knew negotiation by heart. The health insurance takes effect from the day the contract is signed. No waiting period. It covers every member of the family. Lenny didn't hang up. Her hand still held the phone to her ear, but her eyes had turned toward Brinley's room. The pink beaded bracelet on her little sister's wrist glimmered faintly under the hallway light. Brinley shifted in her sleep, pulled the blanket up to her shoulder, and slept on, knowing nothing about rent, knowing nothing about insurance, knowing nothing about the name Crosby Vane or what that name represented. Brinley only knew that when she woke up tomorrow morning, her sister would be there. And Lenny knew that in order to keep being there every morning, sometimes you had to step through doors you normally would never knock on. What time? Lenny asked. 8 in the morning. Vane Tower. Main lobby. I'll be there. She hung up, looked at the laptop screen one last time, then she closed the lid, and this time, she didn't open it again. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, Lenny stepped through the revolving doors of Vane Tower. The main lobby was paved in marble, with high ceilings and light pouring down from above, making everything look like the inside of a museum built for the rich. Around her were perfectly tailored suits, polished leather shoes, the scent of expensive perfume. And in the middle of all that, Lenny stood in old jeans, a jacket frayed at the cuffs, and faded sneakers she had bought from a thrift store 3 years earlier. She looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong building. A woman hurried toward her from the reception desk, her hair pinned neatly into a bun, wearing a black suit, her face carrying the expression of someone used to sorting out who belonged here and who didn't. Paige Northcutt looked Lenny up and down, making no effort to hide her judgment. Who do you have an appointment with? Crosby Vane. Paige looked at her for one more second, the kind of look that said she didn't believe her, but also didn't want to waste time arguing. Then she turned on her heel, signaled for Leanie to follow, and took her into the elevator up to the 40th floor without saying another word the entire way. The elevator doors opened. The hallway was wide and quiet, the kind of quiet that belonged to places where noise didn't dare step inside. Paige led Leanie to a conference room at the end of the hallway, then left. The conference room was large, but there were only 2 people inside. Crosby Vane sat at the far end of the long glass table, his back straight, both hands resting on the tabletop. Dorsey stood behind him, leaning against the wall, his arms folded across his chest. No one stood up. No one shook her hand. No one invited Leanie to sit. Crosby looked at her with eyes Leanie recognized at once as the eyes of a man used to judging people in the first few seconds. He didn't need small talk to know who she was. He only needed to look. Then Crosby pushed a laptop toward her across the glass table. The screen was already open, showing a dense set of financial data. "Find the problem," he said. 24 hours. Leanie pulled out a chair and sat down, but she didn't open Crosby's laptop. She opened her backpack, took out her own laptop. Old, thin, its lid covered in stickers from 3 companies that had fired her. Dorsey raised an eyebrow slightly. Crosby didn't react at all. Leanie connected to the data set on Crosby's machine, pulled it over to her own screen, and began working. She didn't ask anything else. She didn't ask where the data came from, who it involved, or why she had been called here. She only read the numbers. Numbers didn't know how to lie, and Leanie knew how to listen when they spoke. Crosby sat still and watched. Dorsey stood still and watched Crosby. There wasn't a sound in the conference room except the tapping of keys. 40 minutes. Leanie stopped. She turned her laptop toward Crosby. On the screen, she had isolated the abnormal transaction chain, marked the money trail, and redrawn the entire structure of the vulnerability in a diagram that even someone who didn't understand finance could see. "This vulnerability isn't an oversight," Leanie said, her voice calm, as if she were reporting the weather. "Someone designed it deliberately. They hid it inside a valid protocol, used high-level access to create a path for the money flow. Every step looks legal if you look at it separately, but when you put them together, this is a complete extraction system. This isn't someone being careless. This is betrayal." Crosby looked at the screen. Then he looked at Leanie. 10 seconds passed without him saying anything. 10 seconds inside Crosby Vane's conference room felt longer than 10 minutes anywhere else. Dorsey leaned forward slightly, watching his boss's reaction. "How long did it take you?" Crosby asked. 40 minutes. "I gave you 24 hours. I didn't need 24 hours. Crosby almost nodded, the kind of nod from a man who wasn't easily impressed but had just been impressed. "What do you want?" In another place, that question would have sounded like a courtesy. But from Crosby Vane's mouth, it was an open negotiation. Leanie didn't need to think for long. "A contract with health insurance for my sister, effective immediately, and a seat where no one asks what I wear to work." She didn't ask for a high salary, didn't ask for a title, didn't ask for equity or bonuses. Insurance for her sister, and the right to be herself. Crosby looked at Dorsey. Dorsey gave a slight nod, the kind of nod that said, "She isn't normal, but that's exactly what you're looking for." Crosby turned back to Leanie. "Monday, 7 in the morning. Don't be late." Leanie stood, folded her laptop back into her backpack, and walked out of the conference room on the 40th floor of Vane Tower in the same faded sneakers she had worn when she walked in. No one escorted her to the elevator. Lenny's first Monday at Vane Capital began with a meeting she hadn't been invited to. She was sitting at the temporary desk arranged for her in a corner of the 39th floor when Dorsey appeared. "Up to the 40th floor. Main conference room. The boss wants you to sit in and listen." The main conference room that day held 12 people, the entire senior leadership team of Vane Capital. Lenny was introduced with exactly one sentence from Crosby. "New analyst. End of the table." No one asked her name. No one shook her hand. A few people glanced at her, then turned back to their files. Lenny pulled out a chair, opened her old sticker-covered laptop among the long row of brand-new company computers, and listened. The subject of the meeting was the acquisition of Whitfield Logistics, a transportation company in financial trouble. Vane Capital had been negotiating for 3 months and still hadn't closed the price. The strategy team presented the familiar plan. Continue negotiating, wait for Whitfield to weaken further, force the price down, Drag it out for another 2 quarters if necessary. Patience is a weapon, the person leading the meeting said. They'll have to accept our terms. Heads around the table nodded along. Except Lenny. She didn't nod. She didn't shake her head either. She typed something on her laptop for about 2 minutes, then raised her hand. The whole room looked at her as if a chair had suddenly learned how to speak. Crosby, seated at the head of the table, gave a slight nod. Speak. There's no need to buy Whitfield, Lenny said, her voice calm. Buy their supply chain. Their 3 main suppliers need cash flow urgently. I just checked their public financial reports. If Vane Capital buys the contracts with these 3 suppliers, Whitfield will become completely dependent on us without us spending a single dollar to buy shares. There's no need to break down the door when you can shut off the water. Silence. The kind of silence that happens when people need a few seconds to process what they've just heard. Barrett Klein, the chief financial officer, was the one who broke that silence. He sat up straighter, his face hardening. Not feasible. The cost of acquiring the supply chain would exceed this quarter's budget. The profit margins of those 3 suppliers are negative. The risk is too high. He opened a spreadsheet from his computer and turned the screen so the whole room could see. The numbers were very specific, very detailed, the kind of figures only someone with the highest level of access to internal financial data could have. Leanie looked at Barrett's figures. Then she looked back at the numbers on her own laptop. The 2 sets of numbers didn't match. Not by a small margin. They contradicted each other at a structural level. The data Barrett presented said the cost would be very high. The data Leanie had analyzed from public sources showed a much lower figure. One of the 2 sets of numbers was lying. Leanie said nothing. She didn't challenge Barrett in front of everyone. She only gave a small nod, the kind of nod from someone who had registered something and tucked it away. But in her mind, a question mark had already been placed. Why was the chief financial officer using false data to block a sound strategy? Crosby looked at Barrett, then at Leanie, then back at the spreadsheet on Leanie's screen. Run Miss Shaw's approach, he said. 1 week. Report directly to me. Barrett opened his mouth as if to say more, but Crosby had already stood. The meeting was over. Barrett walked out of the room faster than everyone else, his steps quick and neat, the stride of a man calculating something. Lenny watched him go and remembered it. Then she turned back to her laptop, opened a new file, named it Personal Notes, and typed the first line. On the 3rd day of the week, Leanie discovered something else. While reviewing the financial reporting process to understand the system, she realized that a young accounting employee on the 27th floor was being forced to alter the numbers in the monthly expense reports, not because they were wrong, but to make them match a template sent down from the chief financial officer's office. That employee didn't dare refuse because she had been there for less than a year, and no one wanted to lose a job at Vane Capital. Leanie didn't report anyone, didn't send an email, didn't knock on anyone's office door. She sat back down at her desk and rewrote the reporting process, adding a verification step that required cross-approval from 2 departments before anyone could change the numbers. Fraud became impossible without anyone being named directly. The young accounting employee was protected without ever knowing who had protected her. Paige knew. She managed the 27th floor and noticed the moment the process changed. That afternoon, Paige walked past Lenny's desk and stopped. You didn't have to do that. No one pays you extra for helping a low-level employee. Lenny looked up. I know. Paige stood there for 1 more beat. Then she walked away. But from that day on, every time she saw Lenny in the elevator, Paige gave her a nod in greeting. A small nod, one almost no one noticed. But in Vane Tower, where indifference was the default language, a nod from Paige Northcutt was worth more than a letter of praise. At the end of the 2nd week, a thick envelope from Hale Enterprise was delivered to Vane Tower. Monroe Hale, the West Coast tycoon, a man whom even people in the hidden upper world rarely wanted to mention by name in public, had sent over a joint investment proposal. On the surface, the deal looked appealing. 2 organizations would put capital into an interstate luxury goods transportation project, split the profits 50-50, and share logistics infrastructure. It was a contract thicker than 100 pages, written in the kind of legal language where every sentence had to be read 3 times before its meaning fully settled in. Crosby handed the file to the senior team for analysis. 3 days. 12 people reviewed every page, every clause, every appendix. The general conclusion was that the deal was profitable, the risk was acceptable, and they should sign. Barrett Klein agreed too, with a rare enthusiasm for a chief financial officer who was usually cautious about everything. Leanie wasn't part of the team assigned to analyze it, but she heard the conclusion in the conference room, and something about it left her uneasy. A deal that Monroe Hale had sent over on his own initiative, with benefits split evenly and no major visible binding conditions. In Leanie's experience, when something looked too perfect, it was usually because the imperfect part was sitting where people weren't looking. She knocked on Dorsey's office door. "Let me see the Hale file." Dorsey looked at her. 12 people have already read it. Then I'll be the 13th. If I don't find anything, you lose 15 minutes of my time. If I do find something, you save a lot more than 15 minutes. Dorsey handed over the file. Leanie took it back to her desk, opened it, and didn't start reading from the first page like everyone else. She flipped straight to the appendices. The appendices were where people hid the things they didn't want anyone to find, because appendices were long, boring, and most people gave up after reading a few pages. 15 minutes. Leanie closed the file, went straight up to the 40th floor, and knocked on Crosby's office door without going through Dorsey. Crosby was reading something on his computer. He looked up at her, said nothing, and waited. "Don't sign," Lenny said. "Why?" "There's a clause in the appendix that allows the partner to unilaterally transfer asset management rights if Vane Capital violates any of the listed conditions. And the list of conditions is written so that violation is inevitable. It isn't a matter of if, it's a matter of when. If you sign, within 6 months Monroe Hale will control your entire transportation division without spending another dollar." Crosby reread the passage in the appendix that Leanie had marked. Slowly, carefully. Then he set the file down. 12 people didn't see it. 12 people read from the first page. I read from the appendix. People don't hide the key at the front door. Crosby looked at her for a while longer. It wasn't the assessing gaze he had used the first time they met. It was the gaze of a man rearranging someone's place inside his mind. "Can you fix it?" "Fix it?" Leanie tilted her head slightly. "I can do more than that. Give me 2 hours. 2 hours later, Leanie came back with the appendix rewritten. She hadn't removed the trap. She had reversed it. If Monroe signed this revised version, he would be the one to lose control of his assets in the event of a violation, and the list of conditions had been rewritten by Leanie in exactly the same way Monroe had written it for Vane, meaning violation would also only be a matter of time. Crosby read the revised version, then read it again. And then he did something that Dorsey, who had been with Crosby for 12 years, said he had never seen in this office. Crosby smiled. Not the polite smile used in negotiations. Not the calculating smile used to make an opponent lower his guard, but a real smile. The kind that belonged to a man who had just found something rare after searching for it for a very long time. "Send this version to Monroe," Crosby told Dorsey. "As written. Don't change a word." Dorsey took the file, looked at Leanie, then looked back at Crosby. When he stepped out into the hallway, Dorsey spoke softly enough that only Crosby was supposed to hear. But Leanie still caught it. "This girl is more frightening than I thought." Crosby didn't turn around, but his voice was still clear. "That's exactly why she's sitting here." Leanie left the office and returned to her desk on the 39th floor. She opened the personal notes file on her old laptop, scrolled to the last line and added a new one. Second note. Barrett Klein had read the entire Hale Enterprise file and failed to detect the trap. Either he wasn't good enough, or he saw it and said nothing. Leanie didn't yet know which answer was true, but she knew that a chief financial officer with the highest level of access to the organization's data didn't miss a trap hidden in an appendix because of inexperience. Monroe Hale wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat without looking the winner straight in the eye. 3 days after receiving the contract that had been turned against him, he invited Crosby Vane to a private dinner. No lawyers, no intermediaries, a direct call from his personal number, the kind of call between two men of equal rank who wanted to measure which one stood taller. Crosby accepted. Before the dinner, he called Leanie up to his office. "I need to know everything about Monroe Hale. Weaknesses, debts, which partners are wavering, which projects are bleeding money. Condense it onto one sheet of paper." Leanie took 2 hours. When she placed the sheet on his desk, it was only 1 page, printed on one side. But every line was a knife. Crosby read it, folded it in half, and slipped it into the pocket of his suit jacket. No comment. The dinner took place at a private restaurant by Ashford Bay, the kind of place you wouldn't find on a map unless you had been invited. Only the two of them sat across from each other. Dorsey stood outside. Monroe's men were outside too. Inside the dining room, the surface was more polite than any negotiation. Monroe Hale spoke first. He was 45 years old, with prematurely silver hair in the way rich men went silver, not the way old men did. His voice was soft and slow, the kind of voice people used when they wanted the other person to listen to every word. "I hear you have someone new," Monroe began, cutting into his steak while his eyes stayed on Crosby. "A young woman, no degree, no background, no one backing her. Interesting, Crosby. How long can you trust her?" Crosby didn't rush to answer. He lifted his glass of water, took a sip, and set it down. "Long enough for her to read the contract my 12 people reviewed and still missed the appendix. Took her 15 minutes. Monroe's expression didn't change, but the hand holding the knife stopped for half a second. That half second said more than any words could. "You're letting an outsider look inside the organization," Monroe said. "That's a risk. That's my decision. Decisions can be wrong." "You're right. Decisions can be wrong. For example, the decision to send a trapped contract to someone you don't fully understand. That was a wrong decision." Monroe set down his knife and fork. For the first time during the dinner, he did nothing at all, only looked at Crosby. "But I didn't come here to talk about old matters," Crosby continued, his voice still even. "I also wanted to ask about the logistics project you're rolling out in the West. I hear it's running quite far over budget, and your main partner in Portland, Mr. Whitmore, seems to be looking for a way out. The debt you're hiding from the bank is also coming up for restructuring soon, if I remember correctly." Every sentence Crosby spoke was a chess piece placed on the board, not hurried, not harsh, just the truth, spoken at the right time, in the right place, in exactly the right amount for Monroe to understand that Crosby knew more than he had expected. Monroe Hale straightened in his chair. His face wasn't angry. It was worse than angry. It was completely blank. The kind of blankness that belonged to a man recalculating everything. "I didn't come here to threaten you, Monroe," Crosby said, placing his napkin on the table, the signal that the dinner was over from his side. "I came to make one thing clear. I consider the last time a lesson. Next time, I'll consider it a declaration of war. And you know how I treat war." Crosby stood, walked out, didn't shake hands. Didn't wait for Monroe to answer. Dorsey opened the car door. Crosby got in, the door closed, and the car disappeared into the Ashford night. Monroe Hale remained at the dining table for another 5 minutes. Alone. Then he picked up his phone and called a number already saved in it. The person on the other end answered after the second ring. "Accelerate the plan," Monroe said. "I need Vane to collapse before the end of the quarter." The person on the other end didn't ask again, only said, "Understood," then hung up. That same night, another call took place. Sterling Vane, Crosby's father, 60 years old, the man who had built the foundation for the empire his son was now running, sat in the reading room of his suburban mansion. He called Barrett Klein, "The new girl my son hired. Tell me about her." Barrett was silent for a beat, then spoke, his voice weighing every word. "She changed the financial process without going through the board, challenged the senior team's strategy in her first meeting, and Crosby listens to her more than he listens to the board." Sterling didn't answer immediately. The faint sound of a page turning drifted through the room. "Stay in touch," he said. "I need to know everything she does." Barrett said, "Yes," then hung up. That night, in 3 different places across Ashford City, 3 men laid their own separate plans. Monroe wanted to destroy Crosby. Sterling wanted to control Crosby. Barrett stood between them both, and no one knew how many masters he was serving. And Leanie Shaw, the woman who had indirectly stirred all of this into motion, was sitting in her suburban apartment, restringing the broken beaded bracelet for her little sister, completely unaware that the storm was gathering. After the failed dinner with Crosby, Monroe Hale did what anyone in his position would do. He looked into the person who had made him lose face. The contract hadn't been turned against him by Crosby. Crosby was good at finance, but he wasn't the kind of man who sat there reading appendices. Someone had read it for him, and Monroe needed to know who that person was. He sent his private surveillance team to Ashford. Not the noisy kind of team. The kind that knew how to sit in a car for 3 hours without anyone realizing they were there. It took only 2 days for them to find the answer. A 27-year-old woman with no background in the underworld, no reputation, no name, newly hired at Vane Capital less than a month ago. Lennox Shaw, Monroe read the report and said only one sentence to his men. "Follow her. I want to know where she lives, where she goes, who she meets, and most important, what she's afraid to lose." That Thursday afternoon, Leanie left Vane Tower earlier than usual. Brinley was home with the neighbor who helped watch her in the afternoon, and Leanie needed to stop by the supermarket to buy food for the whole week. She drove her old car out of the parking garage and turned left out of habit. Nothing seemed unusual at the first two intersections. By the third intersection, Leanie glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a black car. Not because the car was special, because she had seen it at the first intersection. Leanie didn't panic. The years she had spent growing up in the foster system, moving from one home to another, living with strangers, learning to read other people's intentions before they had time to act, had given her something no university could teach: instinct. And that instinct was now telling her that someone was following her. She didn't speed up, didn't slam the brakes. She turned on her right signal and pulled into a crowded residential area where the streets were narrow and full of turns. Her right hand stayed on the wheel while her left hand called Dorsey. "There's a car following me. Black, dark windows, 3 intersections now. I'm in Maple Ridge, heading east." Dorsey didn't ask if she was sure. He only said, 10 minutes, then hung up. Leanie kept driving, turning left, turning right, circling through the neighborhood where people were walking on the sidewalks. The black car still followed, but from a greater distance. They knew she had noticed them. 9 minutes later, one of Dorsey's cars appeared behind the black car. Then another blocked the front. The black car turned sharply into an alley and disappeared. No confrontation, no chase, just vanished as though it had never been there, the way professionals vanished when they knew exactly when to pull back. Dorsey called again. "Clear. You come back to Vane Tower, right now." Leanie turned the car back toward the tower. Dorsey met her in the lobby and took her straight up to the 40th floor. Crosby was standing in front of the glass wall, looking down over the city. When Dorsey recounted what had happened, Crosby didn't turn around, didn't shout, didn't slam his fist on the table. He placed both hands against the glass, bowed his head slightly forward, and when he spoke, his voice dropped lower than usual. The kind of voice Dorsey knew was more dangerous than any shout. "Take her and her sister to the beach house. From today on, someone stays with them 24/7. Dorsey nodded, then asked one more thing. "Do you want us to deal with the surveillance team?" Crosby turned around. His eyes weren't cold now. They were burning, but in a controlled way. The kind of fire a person keeps contained until the right moment to use it. "Not yet. I want to know who sent them first. Once I know, I'll decide how to handle it." Leanie stood beside them, hearing everything, but saying nothing. She wasn't afraid for herself. She had lived through enough to know fear didn't solve anything. But when she thought of Brinley sitting at home, waiting for her sister to come back for dinner, her fingers tightened around the strap of her backpack a little harder. That night, Dorsey drove Leanie back to the old apartment to get their things. She packed Brinley's clothes into the suitcase first, then her own. Brinley woke up halfway through, her eyes narrowed and heavy with sleep. "Where are we going, Leanie?" "On vacation," Leanie said. "The new house has the ocean." "A real ocean?" Brinley's eyes lit up, even though she was still sleepy. "A real one." The two sisters got into the car. Dorsey drove. Ashford's night slid past the windows. Brinley fell asleep again on her sister's shoulder before the car even left the city, and Leanie watched the rearview mirror the entire way, until she was certain there wasn't any black car following them anymore. The beach house was more than an hour's drive from Ashford, at the end of a narrow road that Google Maps hadn't bothered to name. Brinley woke when the car stopped, looked out through the window, and drew in a long breath. "Leanie, do you hear that? It's the ocean." She jumped out of the car before Leanie could even unbuckle her seatbelt, ran straight onto the porch, and stood on the wooden step, breathing in the smell of salt. The house wasn't large, but it was clean and fully stocked, the kind of house someone kept ready for the moments when they needed to disappear from the city. Brinley didn't care about anything except the fact that the house had the ocean, and the ocean had waves. She ran everywhere for the first 15 minutes, then found the dining table in the kitchen by herself, climbed onto a chair, and opened the box of plastic beads she had brought in her little backpack. This was Brinley's habit every night. No matter where she was, no matter what had happened during the day, at night she sat down and strung bracelets. A box of beads in every color, a thin elastic cord, and the solemn concentration of a 7-year-old child making the most important thing in the world. That night, Brinley made 3 bracelets. The first was all pink beads. For herself. The second was all purple beads. For Lenny, because you like purple. For the third, Brinley chose green and red beads, alternating them carefully, stringing each one with care, then tying the knot. Then she slid down from the chair and ran into the living room, where Crosby was standing near the glass doors, looking out at the ocean in the dark. He had arrived at the beach house about an hour earlier with Dorsey to check the security. But once everything was settled, Dorsey went outside to patrol, and Crosby stayed behind. Maybe because he wanted to make sure everything was safe. Maybe because of some other reason he wasn't ready to admit yet. Brinley stopped in front of Crosby. She had to tilt her head up very high because he was nearly 3 times her height. Wear it. Brinley held up the green and red bracelet. I made it for you because you stand alone a lot. Crosby looked at the plastic beaded bracelet in the tiny hand lifted toward him. On his other wrist, he wore a watch worth enough to buy the entire street Brinley had been living on. He said nothing. He accepted the bracelet and slipped it onto his other wrist. The green and red plastic beads rested against his skin, looking so out of place they were almost funny. But no one laughed. Brinley smiled, then ran off, going back to the table to string a few more bracelets for her stuffed bear. Dorsey stood outside the door and saw everything through the glass. He turned away and made no comment. There were moments when even the most loyal man knew he shouldn't be there. Later that night, when Brinley had fallen asleep in the small room, hugging her stuffed bear with 3 spare bracelets on the bedside table, Lenny stepped out onto the back porch. Crosby was already sitting there, in an old wooden chair, looking out at the dark sea. The waves rolled in steadily. The wind carried the smell of salt. Lenny sat down in the chair beside him, leaving just enough space between them. Neither of them said anything for the first few minutes. Then Lenny spoke, not because she wanted to talk, but because tonight, after the black car, after the sudden move, after the way Brinley had looked at her and asked, "Where are we going?" Lenny, she needed to say it to someone, and the man sitting beside her was the only person here. I grew up in the foster system, Lenny said, her voice softer than usual. I don't remember my parents' faces. I only remember that I moved homes 11 times before I turned 18. Every time I moved, I packed my things into the same black plastic bag. Never a suitcase. Children in the system weren't given suitcases. Crosby didn't turn to look at her. But he was listening. Lenny knew because his whole body had gone still, the kind of stillness that belonged to someone holding everything inside. Brinley is the daughter of a woman I met in my last foster home. Her name was May. May was very sick. She had no money for treatment, no family, no one close. When May died, Brinley was only 4 years old. No one took her in. The system was going to put her into the same cycle I'd gone through. 11 moves, 11 black plastic bags. Lenny paused for a beat. I was 24, no degree, no steady job, no home. But I knew where that cycle took people, so I took Brinley. She looked out at the sea. I'm not good because I want to be good. I'm good because I don't have the right to fail. Every mistake I make isn't only my mistake anymore. It affects a 7-year-old child sleeping in that room who believes the world is all right because her sister is here. The waves kept breaking. The sea wind grew colder. Crosby sat still for a very long time. Then he spoke, his voice lower than usual, the kind of voice Lenny had never heard him use before. My sister's name was Noelle. She was 17. She died 10 years ago, because of the world I chose to step into. He didn't explain further, didn't give the details. He only said it as though setting down something he had carried for too long. I built all of this so no one could touch the people I cared about again. That tower, that empire, all of it. And I still fail every day, because the person I cared about most is gone. Lenny didn't say, I understand, because she knew no one truly understood another person's pain. She didn't say, I'm sorry, either, because apologies changed nothing. She only sat there beside him, looking at the same stretch of sea, listening to the same sound of waves. Sometimes presence was enough. They sat there for a long time without saying anything more, and when Lenny finally stood and went back into the house, she saw that the green and red beaded bracelet was still on Crosby's wrist. He hadn't taken it off. 2 weeks after the night by the sea, Barrett Klein decided to make his move. He knew there wasn't much time left. Since Lenny had appeared, every passing week had peeled away another layer of cover. That girl had seen the conflicting data in the strategy meeting. She had changed the reporting process, so altering numbers was no longer easy. She had discovered the trap in the contract that Barrett had deliberately chosen not to mention. Every step she took accidentally exposed him a little more. If he didn't act now, it would only be a matter of time before she connected all the dots. Barrett used his authority as chief financial officer to create a chain of transactions. Transfers through subsidiaries, investments that didn't exist in reality, consulting fees for services that had never been performed. Everything looked legal on the surface, because it all fell within the chief financial officer's authority. And he attached Leanie's employee code to several of the transactions, because she had been given broad access when she analyzed the system shortly after she joined. Her code was in the system. Barrett only had to copy and paste it into the right places. On Tuesday morning, Dorsey performed a routine cash flow check and found an irregularity. He traced it quickly and saw new transactions that had appeared within the last 2 weeks, following the exact same path as the vulnerability Crosby had discovered on the first night, and every trace pointed to one person: Lennox Shaw. Dorsey took the results up to the 40th floor. Crosby read them and said nothing for a while. Then he picked up the phone. "Call Miss Shaw up here." Leanie walked into Crosby's office. Just the two of them. Dorsey stood outside. The door closed. Crosby placed a file on the glass desk and turned it toward Lenny. Inside was the entire chain of abnormal transactions, the money trail, and her employee code appearing in 6 different places. "Explain." One word. No anger in his voice, no disappointment. Just one word placed on the table, heavy as a stone. Leanie looked at the file. Her eyes moved quickly across every transaction line, every code, every number. Her face went pale, not because she was afraid, but because she understood at once what was happening. The conflicting data in the strategy meeting, the order to alter reports coming through the chief financial officer's office, Barrett's unusual resistance when she suggested buying the supply chain, Barrett failing to find the trap in Monroe's contract, all the notes she had written in her personal file over the past several weeks, all those unanswered question marks, now arranged themselves into a single shape. "Give me 6 hours," Leanie said. 3. Leanie looked at Crosby. He looked back. In those 3 seconds, she understood something. He was giving her 3 hours instead of calling security immediately. He was giving her the chance to prove herself, instead of reaching a conclusion first. That meant that even though the evidence on the table pointed to her, Crosby Vane was choosing to believe her before she had proved anything at all. "That's enough," Leanie said. 3 hours. She sat down right there at the conference table in Crosby's office, opened her old laptop, and began. 3 hours. Leanie traced every transaction backward, not by reading the surface figures, but by digging into the metadata, the timestamps of each transaction's creation, the internet protocol address of the machine used, and the system check-in times of every account. The result appeared clearly. Every false transaction had been created from the fixed computer inside the chief financial officer's office. The creation times matched the hours Barrett Klein had checked in at the office. The approving account was one that only the chief financial officer had the authority to sign with. Leanie's employee code had been attached after the transaction was already created, like a layer of paint brushed over a finished picture. And there was more. When Leanie dug into Barrett's internal communication history, she found dozens of calls to an unidentified phone number. The timing of those calls matched exactly with the times Vane Capital's internal information had leaked to the outside. Lenny turned the laptop toward Crosby. He read, slowly, carefully, one line at a time. Then he picked up the phone. "Dorsey, invite Barrett Klein up to my office. Right now." Barrett walked into the conference room 4 minutes later. He saw Leanie sitting at the table with her laptop open, and Crosby standing at the head of the table with the file. In that moment, Barrett's eyes met Lenny's, and he understood. No one had to say a word. He understood that everything was over. Crosby placed the evidence on the table. Barrett looked through it, his face slowly turning gray. Then he tried to steady himself. "You don't understand. Monroe Hale will destroy this organization. I was trying to protect." "Protect whom?" Crosby cut him off, his voice still even, but so cold the air in the room seemed to thicken. $80 million, 6 months, right in front of me. You weren't protecting the organization. You were trying to protect yourself. And you did it by putting the blame on the only person here who was actually helping me?" Barrett opened his mouth, about to say more. Crosby raised a hand. Dorsey, take Mr. Klein away. Revoke all access and company devices. From this minute on, he has nothing more to do with Vane Capital. Barrett stood. Dorsey opened the door. There was no dragging, no shouting. Barrett Klein walked out of the conference room on the 40th floor on his own feet, his back still straight, but his face carrying the expression of a man who had just played his final hand and lost. But Barrett Klein wasn't the kind of man who lost without leaving something behind. 2 hours before being called up to Crosby's office, when he noticed Dorsey checking the cash flow more carefully than usual, his instinct for self-preservation had made him do one last thing. He called Monroe Hale and sent over everything he knew about Lennox Shaw. Not company data. Personal information. Her weakness. The thing she was willing to sacrifice everything to protect. The thing that, if targeted, would bring her to her knees. Monroe received the information while Barrett was being escorted out of the building by Dorsey. He read it, and for the first time since beginning his war with Crosby Vane, Monroe Hale smiled. Not a happy smile, but the smile of a man who had just found the weakest place in the wall he wanted to break. 10 days after Barrett Klein left Vane Tower, a court officer arrived on the 39th floor in the middle of the morning. He asked for Lennox Shaw, handed her a brown envelope stamped by the Ashford County Court, asked her to sign for it, and then walked away. Lenny opened the envelope right there at her desk. Inside was a summons. A petition to review guardianship over Brinley Shaw, filed with the court by an attorney representing a party concerned with the child's welfare. The petition cited reasons that Lenny knew were lies the moment she read them, written in clean, polished legal language, the kind of language drafted by an expensive attorney hired by someone with money, not the kind of petition an ordinary person would write on their own. Leanie read the first page, then the second. Halfway through the third page, her hands began to tremble. Not from the cold. It was the trembling of someone using every bit of strength she had to keep everything inside from breaking out. She set the papers down on the desk, stood up, walked into the hallway. After 10 steps, she sank down to the floor, her back against the wall, both arms wrapped around her knees. This was the first time since walking into Vane Tower that Lennox Shaw lost her composure. She had faced a sabotaged financial system without flinching. She had sat in front of Crosby Vane when he placed false evidence on the table and still kept her voice steady. She had found traps, reversed traps, cleared her name, and exposed a traitor without her hands shaking once. But this wasn't a data problem. This was Brinley. And when it came to Brinley, every piece of intelligence in the world was meaningless when the opponent used the law as a weapon. Paige Northcutt found Leanie there 5 minutes later, when she passed through the hallway on her way to a meeting. Paige stopped, looked at Leanie sitting on the floor, arms around her knees, eyes fixed straight ahead into empty space. Paige didn't ask what had happened, didn't ask if she was all right. She simply sat down beside Leanie, leaned her back against the same wall, and stayed there. Leanie spoke, her voice flat. Someone wants to change the guardianship. I can solve every problem in the world, but I can't solve this one. Paige didn't answer. She only sat there. Sometimes, presence was the only thing that mattered. Dorsey knew within an hour. He took a copy of the summons up to the 40th floor. Crosby read it, set it down, and walked to the glass wall. He stood there for several minutes, looking down over Ashford Bay. Then he turned back. This is Monroe. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Dorsey nodded. The attorney who filed it belongs to a small firm in the suburbs. Newly established 2 months ago. Looks like a shell. Hire the team from Hargrove and Klein. Right now. They're the best team on the East Coast for family cases. It'll be very expensive. I didn't ask the price. I said hire them. Dorsey walked out. Crosby went down to the 39th floor. Leanie had returned to her desk, her face still pale, but her back was straight again. She was trying to read the summons for the 3rd time, searching for any weakness in the legal language. Crosby pulled out a chair and sat across from her, not at the head of the table the way he did in the conference room. He sat level with her, at the same eye line. I lost Noelle because I chose the wrong way, he said. I won't let you lose your sister for the same reason. This time, we do it the right way. Leanie looked at him, and the question she asked wasn't the question most people would ask. She didn't ask, how? She asked, why? Why would Crosby Vane, the East Coast kingpin, a man who had built an empire by trusting no one and owing no one, step forward to protect the guardianship rights of an employee who had joined less than 2 months ago? Crosby looked at her, and for the first time, Leanie saw something in his eyes besides calculation. Because you reminded me that some things are worth protecting the right way, not the fast way, the right way. Leanie said nothing for a while. Then she stood, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and when she spoke, her voice had returned to the voice Crosby had heard for the first time in the conference room on the 40th floor, the voice of someone who didn't accept defeat. You hire the lawyers. I'll prepare the evidence. For the next 2 days, Leanie didn't sleep. Not figuratively. Literally. She sat in front of the laptop in the study at the beach house, tracing every thread that led to the petition. The attorney who filed it belonged to a new firm. That firm was funded by a charitable foundation, registered in Delaware. That foundation had received money through a chain of transfers, and when Leanie followed that chain to its end, the starting point lay in an account connected to Hale Enterprise, Monroe Hale. She created a file, proving the entire path from Monroe to the petition. Not guesses, not assumptions. Financial evidence with timestamps, transaction codes, and the names of the signers. Evidence showing that this wasn't genuine concern for a child's welfare. This was a weapon created by a criminal organization to attack an enemy's employee. When Leanie brought the file to the office of the Hargrove and Klein legal team, the lead attorney read through it for 10 minutes, then set it down. Who are you? The person who won't let anyone change my sister's guardianship. The attorney looked at her, then looked back at the file, then nodded. The kind of nod that came from a person who had just realized his client didn't only have the best legal team on the East Coast, but also something most clients didn't have, a will that would never stop. The guardianship review hearing took place on a Wednesday morning at the Ashford County Courthouse. The courtroom was smaller than Leanie had imagined, with a low ceiling, fluorescent light, the kind of room where decisions that changed entire lives were made between white-painted walls and old wooden chairs. Leanie sat on one side with the Hargrove and Klein legal team. Across from her, the attorney representing the party concerned with the child's welfare sat with his back straight, his files arranged neatly, his face expressionless. The kind of attorney paid a great deal of money to keep his face expressionless. Leanie's attorney presented the evidence briefly. The financial records showed that the petition had been funded through a chain of shell companies, all leading back to Hale Enterprise. This wasn't a genuine concern for a child's welfare. This was an organized attack aimed at the guardian. The judge read the file, took notes, and didn't comment right away. Then she called the witness. Crosby Vane stepped up to the witness stand. Inside that small courtroom in the county courthouse, the most powerful kingpin on the East Coast of America looked so out of place that almost everyone could tell he didn't belong there. But he was there, sworn in, his hand resting on the table. And he spoke. Crosby didn't speak at length. He wasn't the kind of man who needed many sentences to make one point clear. Lennox Shaw is the most trustworthy person I've worked with in the past 15 years. She doesn't have a degree, but she has something I rarely see in anyone. She's willing to sacrifice everything for her sister. Not sacrifice in words, but in every day, every decision, every sleepless night. I guarantee, on my personal honor, that Brinley Shaw is being cared for by the best person she could possibly have. The opposing attorney tried to question the relationship between Crosby and Lennie, hinting that his support had a motive. Crosby looked that attorney straight in the eyes and said, I once lost my sister. I don't want to watch someone else lose theirs. That is the entire motive. The courtroom went silent. The opposing attorney asked nothing more. Then Leanie asked for permission to speak. The judge allowed it. Leanie stood. No prepared statement. No notes. She stood before the courtroom exactly as herself. No more and no less. I'm not perfect, Leanie began, her voice softer than usual, but every word was clear. I don't have a college degree. I don't own a home. I don't have a family in the way most people understand family. But I do have one thing. She paused for a beat. The first night Brinley slept at my place, she was 4 years old. She held a small pillow and curled up on the bed. Before she fell asleep, she looked at me and asked, Are you going to sleep here too? I said, Yes, I'm here. And from that night on, every morning when Brinley wakes up, the first thing she does is look over at my bed to check whether her sister is still there. Leanie looked straight at the judge. Every morning, for 3 years, she looks, and every morning, I'm there. I'm not perfect, but I'm present. Every day, and I'll keep being present. The courtroom fell into the kind of silence no one wanted to break. The judge wrote a few more lines of notes. Then she set down her pen, looked at both sides, and announced that the petition to review guardianship was dismissed. The reason? There was no sufficiently strong legal basis. The evidence showed signs that the petition had been funded by a third party for a purpose unrelated to the child's welfare. And most importantly, there was no evidence at all that the current guardian was unfit to care for the child. Leanie heard the ruling without moving. She sat still, both hands resting on her lap, her eyes fixed straight ahead. Then she stood, shook the attorney's hand, and walked outside. Beyond the courthouse, the morning sun slanted through the line of trees. Dorsey stood beside the black car, and next to him, a 7-year-old girl was sitting on the steps, her legs swinging, a small box in her hands. Brinley saw Leanie coming out through the courthouse doors. Her eyes lit up. She jumped down from the step and ran on her little legs, in her pink sneakers, with all the strength of a 7-year-old child running toward the most important person in the world. Leanie, you were gone so long. I made 4 more bracelets. Leanie dropped to her knees, hugged Brinley, hugged her so tightly the little girl giggled because she was being squeezed. And for the first time, the only time in this entire story, Lennox Shaw cried. Not because she was sad, but because she felt light, because the heaviest thing she had ever carried on her shoulders had just been set down, even if only for this one moment. Crosby stood a few steps away, his hands in his pockets, his back leaning against the car. Dorsey stood beside him. Both of them watched the 2 sisters holding each other under the morning sun in front of the courthouse steps. No one said anything. There are moments when words are the most unnecessary thing in the world. Monroe Hale lost in court, but he didn't stop. A man like Monroe didn't lose twice the same way. If he couldn't break Crosby from the outside, he would break him from within. And inside the Vane syndicate, there were already cracks Monroe only needed to pour more money into to widen. 3 senior council members, Morrison, Dalton, and Webb, men who had been loyal to Sterling Vane since the old man was still in command, received offers from Monroe during the week right after the hearing. Not threats, money. Monroe bought Morrison's debt through an intermediary company, transferred funds to Dalton through the shell of Hale Consulting, and promised Webb a position in the new organization if Crosby was overthrown. In return, all 3 demanded an emergency council meeting with one single item on the agenda. Crosby Vane would resign and hand control back to Sterling. Paige Northcutt was the first to realize something was wrong. That afternoon, she saw Morrison, Dalton, and Webb all appear on the 40th floor after business hours. The 3 men rarely met outside official conference rooms, yet now they were standing in the hallway, speaking with the expressions of men about to do something large. Paige called Lennie immediately. Lennie didn't go up to the 40th floor. She sat at her desk, and in less than 1 hour, she had dug through the most recent financial records of all 3 men, who had just received money from where, who owed whom, who remained neutral on the council, and who had chosen a side. She sent everything to Crosby through the internal encrypted messaging system, along with one single line. 3 men, Morrison, Dalton, Webb, all tied to Monroe, files attached. Crosby read the message on his phone right outside the conference room door. Inside, the 3 council members were already seated. Sterling Vane was there too, sitting silently in the corner of the room, both hands resting on the head of his cane, his face expressionless. Crosby texted back one word, noted. Then he slipped the phone into his pocket and walked in. Morrison spoke first. His voice had been prepared, every sentence tidy, every argument arranged in order. The organization was losing money. It was being attacked constantly from the outside. Personnel were unstable. Partners' trust was weakening. And the person responsible for all of it, according to Morrison, was Crosby. We propose that you resign and return operational control to someone with the experience to keep the organization steady in difficult times. Morrison's eyes flicked toward Sterling. Dalton nodded. The script had already been arranged, each man with his role, all of them waiting for Crosby to fall. Crosby listened to the end. He didn't interrupt anyone, didn't react when his name was placed beside the word failure. He simply sat there, his back straight, his hands on the table, and when the 3 men had finished speaking, he began. Mr. Morrison, Crosby said, his voice as even as the surface of a lake. Monroe Hale bought your debt 3 weeks ago through Greenfield Holdings. The amount matches exactly what you owe the bank. I have a copy of the transaction. Morrison's face went pale. Mr. Dalton, Hale Consulting transferred money to you last month. It's unclear what consulting service this was for, since that company has no employees except one part-time secretary. I have a copy of that as well. Dalton didn't move, but his right hand tightened around the arm of his chair. Mr. Webb, I don't yet have concrete financial evidence, but I'm guessing Monroe's promise to you was more verbal. Would you like to tell me about it? Or should I let the internal investigation team ask instead? Webb didn't answer. He didn't need to. His face had already answered for him. If there are no further questions, Crosby said, I consider this meeting over. You may leave, and you should spend your time thinking about whether you want to remain in this organization and under what conditions, or whether you don't want to remain at all. The three men stood and walked out. No one looked back. The door closed. Only 2 people remained in the conference room. Crosby sat at the head of the table. Sterling sat in the corner. The distance between father and son was a long glass table. But in truth, that distance was much wider than that. Crosby took a folded sheet of paper from the inside pocket of his suit jacket, placed it on the table, pushed it toward Sterling. It was the communication history between Sterling Vane and Monroe Hale over the past 3 months. Number of calls, duration, dates and times, including the call in which Sterling told Barrett to stay in touch on the night Crosby met Monroe at the restaurant. Sterling looked at the paper, didn't pick it up, didn't deny it. I did it for the family, he said, his voice low and slow, the voice of a man who had used that sentence to justify everything for 30 years. Crosby looked at his father, and when he spoke, there was no anger in his voice, no sadness, only the truth, heavy and final. You built this empire at too great a cost, Noel included. I'm trying to rebuild something that doesn't kill anyone else. If you don't understand the difference, then you've lost both your children. Not one. Sterling Vane sat still. For the first time in the life his son could remember, Sterling had no answer. Not because he was calculating, not because he was holding a card back, but because he knew his son was right, and a truth that was right didn't need a reply. Monroe Hale had lost the inside piece, but he still had one final move left. And Monroe's final move wasn't aimed at people. It was aimed at money. In the week after the failed coup, Monroe bought up the debts of the 3 largest partners working with Vane Capital, not directly, but through a chain of investment funds he controlled. Once he held the debt in his hands, Monroe sent out the notices all at once, repay immediately or cut ties. The 3 partners had no choice. They withdrew within a week. Vane Capital lost its 3 largest revenue streams at the same time. Liquidity began to bleed out. Dorsey ran the numbers quickly and gave Crosby the figure. Without a solution, the organization would become insolvent in 30 days. The financial advisors held an emergency meeting and presented 2 options. The first was surrender, sell off assets, shrink the scale, and accept that Monroe had won. The second was war, strike back by every means possible. The kind of war the underworld had been using since before Crosby was born. Crosby listened to both, chose neither. He stood, stepped into the hallway, and walked back to his office. Dorsey followed behind him. The door closed. Only the 2 of them remained. Dorsey spoke first. There's a third option. Fast. Clean. Monroe disappears, and every problem disappears with him. I have people who can handle it. Crosby didn't answer right away. He stood beside his desk, unbuttoned the cuff of his suit jacket, and rolled it up. An unconscious habit whenever he needed to think. And when the sleeve slid up, he saw it. The green and red beaded bracelet, resting just below his watch. The green beads had faded from when they were first strung. The red beads had faded too. The elastic cord was slightly stretched because he had worn it for weeks without taking it off. Crosby's hand stopped on the bracelet for exactly 1 second. Then he pulled the sleeve down. Do it Leanie's way. Publicly. Dorsey looked at him. Are you sure, boss? If going public doesn't work, we lose everything. Crosby straightened his sleeve and buttoned the cuff again. I'm sure. Dorsey asked nothing more. After 12 years beside Crosby Vane, he knew the difference between a decision still being weighed and a decision already made. This was the second kind. Leanie received Crosby's call that same evening. I need you to design a plan. We're going to make everything about Monroe Hale public. Lenny worked through the night. She took all the evidence Barrett had provided after cooperating to reduce the legal consequences for himself, combined it with the data she had gathered over the past 2 months, from the contract trap to the funding trail behind the guardianship petition to the history of bribing council members. Everything was arranged into one coherent file, with timestamps, financial proof, and transaction codes. Not an accusation. The truth, presented in order. The next day, Crosby summoned the full council. 12 people. The conference room on the 40th floor. The long glass table, and sitting across from all of them, in her old jacket, her hair tied back in a hurry, the purple beaded bracelet on her wrist, Lennox Shaw opened her laptop and began to speak. This was the scene where the story had opened. The scene where someone slammed the table and asked, "Who are you to dare sit here?" And Leanie answered, "The person who's going to keep this organization from collapsing in the next 30 days. But the story didn't stop there. After that sentence, Leanie presented, not in a long, drawn-out speech. She projected the evidence onto the screen, item by item, line by line. Monroe Hale's illegal operations, the way he used shell companies to launder money, the way he bought people inside rival organizations, the way he used the legal system as a weapon to attack individuals. Then she presented the second part, the plan to transform Vane Capital. Step by step, moving operations into legality, reducing risk, increasing sustainability, gradually cutting away the business divisions that, if exposed, would bury the entire organization. Lenny looked around the room. This isn't a choice. This is the only path for this organization to survive longer than anyone sitting in this room, including me. The conference room fell silent. Then Crosby stood at the head of the table, where he always sat. Vote. One hand after another rose, not because they liked it, but because looking at the evidence, looking at Monroe collapsing, looking at the position on the board, no one had any other choice left. The file on Monroe Hale was sent to 3 major newsrooms and 2 federal investigative agencies in the same morning. Before noon, the first article was on the front page. Before evening, Monroe Hale had to hire his own legal team to hold the line. Monroe's partners turned away from him. The debts he had bought from Vane Capital's partners became a burden when he himself was now under investigation. No one wanted to be tied to a name appearing on the front page for all the wrong reasons. Monroe Hale's empire didn't collapse in one day. But it began to tilt, and in the world Monroe lived in, once something began to tilt, no one stepped in to hold it up. 6 months later, Vane Tower was still standing there, 40 floors looking down over Ashford Bay. But inside, everything had changed. 60% of Vane Capital's operations had been moved into full legality. New contracts went through lawyers before they went through Crosby. New partners were vetted more carefully than at any point in the organization's history. Profits dropped in the first quarter, but by the second quarter, they had stabilized, and by the 6th month, they had begun to grow again. Slower than in the old days, but stronger. The kind of strength that let people build more floors above without fearing the foundation would collapse. Monroe Hale was still fighting dozens of articles and 2 federal investigations. His West Coast empire was shrinking month by month, like a fire burning from the inside out. Barrett Klein cooperated with investigators to reduce his sentence, living somewhere outside Ashford where no one cared enough to ask after him. Sterling Vane remained at the suburban mansion, still reading every evening. He didn't return to Vane Tower, but once a month, Crosby came to visit. Father and son sat across from each other and talked about small things they'd never had time to talk about before. No one mentioned the night of the coup. There was no need. The 40th floor. Afternoon. Crosby sat at his desk, reading the quarterly report. Dorsey walked in, placed a file on the desk, gave a brief update on the progress of the Transportation Division's transition, then turned to leave. At the door, he stopped. "Boss, you're still wearing that?" Crosby looked up. Then he looked down at his left wrist. The beaded bracelet was still there. The green had faded to almost white. The red had softened into an old pink. The elastic cord had stretched, looser than when it had first been strung, with a few beads turned out of place. It rested right beside a watch, worth as much as a full year's rent on Leanie's old apartment. "As long as it's still here, I'll keep wearing it." Dorsey shook his head. A faint smile touched his mouth, the kind of smile that belonged to a man who had watched too many things change over the past 6 months and didn't need anyone to explain why. Then he stepped out and closed the door behind him. 1 floor below, the 39th floor, Leanie sat at her desk in the private office Crosby had arranged for her 3 months earlier. It wasn't large, it wasn't luxurious, but it had a window looking out over the bay and enough quiet for her to concentrate. Her old sticker-covered laptop still sat beside the new company laptop. She used both. Her phone vibrated. A video call. Brinley's face appeared on the screen, her hair tied into two little pigtails, her eyes bright, her smile missing the baby tooth that had fallen out last week. Brinley was sitting at the study desk in the new house Lenny had rented near the school, a place wide enough for the little girl to have her own room for the first time in her life. On Brinley's wrist was the pink beaded bracelet, the first bracelet she had strung herself on that first night at the beach house. The bracelet had faded too, the pink beads now nearly white, but Brinley didn't take it off. On Leanie's wrist was the purple bracelet, faded too, stretched too, never taken off either. 3 bracelets on 3 wrists in 3 different places across Ashford City, one on the 40th floor, one on the 39th floor, one on the wrist of a 7-year-old girl smiling into a phone screen. "Lenny, what are we eating tonight?" "Pizza," Leanie said. "It's always pizza." Brinley giggled, then ended the call so she could go back to her homework. Leanie watched the screen go dark, smiled, then turned back to work. Life never asks what degree you have or where you come from. Life asks what you're willing to do for the people you love. Leanie had nothing but her mind and a heart that refused to give up. Crosby had everything except a reason to change. They found in each other the thing they were missing. And sometimes, the thing that changes an empire isn't money or power, but a beaded bracelet on a wrist, strung by a 7-year-old child on an ordinary night and given to a grown man who often stood alone. If this story touched you, please like and share it so more people can hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next stories. Because sometimes, the right story at the right time can change the way you see life. How do you feel about Leanie and Crosby's story? Please leave a comment and share the feelings deep in your heart. We always read and treasure every line you write. Wishing all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.